MyAudiobooks.ai Audiobook Lecture Series presents Iran's Revolutionary State, an evidence-based institutional account for students and policymakers, 1979 to 2026. For decades, Iran was America's closest ally in the Middle East. Then, in 1979, everything changed. A revolution, a hostage crisis, and the birth of a regime that would defy the world for 47 years. Wars, sanctions, nuclear standoffs, millions of lives caught in the middle. Now the Supreme Leader is gone, and no one knows what comes next. An exclusive MyAudiobooks.ai audiobook release. Available now on YouTube.
The following audiobooks contain AI-generated content and may contain errors. This audiobook narration presents Iran's Revolutionary State, an evidence-based institutional account for students and policymakers, 1979 to 2026. Topic: Introduction. This lecture asks a simple but urgent question. How did Iran, which in 1979 overthrew a monarchy, become the complex, security-focused state and regional actor encountered in 2026? The answer comes less from a string of isolated events than from a linked process: a revolutionary constitution and institutional design, a diplomatic rupture with the United States, and wartime learning that together reshape politics, security, and strategy. The lecture is aimed at adult learners at an introductory college or advanced high school level, students of international relations and Middle East history, journalists and policy practitioners, and any curious listener who wants to move beyond headlines. Its purpose is practical: to give a clear map of the institutions that matter, to trace the causal links from the revolutionary moment through the wartime consolidation and into the era of nuclear diplomacy and recurring protest, and to equip listeners with a disciplined method for evaluating competing claims. A few orienting facts set the terrain. After the revolution, Iran's constitutional order creates an ultimate, unelected authority alongside elected offices. Bodies such as the Guardian Council and security institutions like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the Basij become central levers of power. The embassy seizure and hostage crisis with the United States deepen mutual suspicion and embed an external threat narrative into domestic politics. Those institutional choices and diplomatic ruptures make survival and security recurring priorities, and they shape how politics is practiced in ways that persist across decades. The central tension the lecture traces is straightforward: a state organized to survive external threat and internal fracture builds capabilities that deter rivals, but also narrow political space and complicate economic adaptation. That trade-off shows up in choices about nuclear technology, in the creation of regional partnerships and proxy networks, and in the tools used to respond to protest. Across 3 parts, the narrative follows how these dynamics unfold, how institutions learn from crisis, and how domestic legitimacy and foreign policy continually reshape one another. Listeners should expect evidence-centered analysis. The lecture draws on public records, contemporaneous reporting, IAEA verification documents where relevant, and a clear analytic discipline. Identify a claim, check what the public record supports, and name the open questions that remain. The aim is not to supply certainty where none exists, but to make transparent where assertions rest on firm evidence, where inference is reasonable, and where genuine ambiguity persists. The stakes are real. Nuclear thresholds, regional stability, and the rights and hopes of millions of Iranians depend in part on institutional choices made decades ago and on decisions being taken now as the region moves into 2026. This lecture will not close every question. It does promise a clearer map, a sharper lens, and a toolkit so listeners can weigh evidence and argument for themselves. With that frame in mind, the lecture begins. End of introduction. The central question organizing this lecture is how three things, often told as separate stories, form one connected narrative. The first is the shape of Iran's post-revolutionary state after 1979. The second is Iran's ruptured relationship with the United States. The third is Iran's long-term regional strategy. We begin with the revolutionary year itself and its immediate aftermath, not as a single dramatic break, but as a period when institutions, political habits, and mutual suspicions take root and echo for decades. By the late 1970s, Iran has reached a particular endpoint. It is a monarchy under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, widely known as the Shah, and it is a close security partner of the United States. In broad terms, the state presents itself as modernizing and development-oriented. Many opponents experience it as politically closed and unevenly responsive to social demands. What matters here is not any single grievance. It is the political chemistry that results. Opposition to the monarchy becomes a space where very different groups can temporarily stand together.
Secular nationalists, religious activists, leftists, liberal reformers, and others do not suddenly agree on Iran's future. They agree for a time on the urgency of ending the existing order and on the belief that the monarchy's power is not meaningfully accountable. That shared negative consensus is strong enough to mobilize. It is also fragile. It postpones the hardest questions until after the monarchy falls, including who governs, under what rules, and with what source of ultimate authority. The speed of the turning point is hard to overstate. On January 16, 1979, the Shah leaves Iran. His departure removes the person around whom the state's legitimacy and coercive power have been organized. It also opens a vacuum in which competing revolutionary visions can move from rhetoric to institutional reality. Then, on February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returns to Iran from exile. In the basic chronology of the revolution, these two dates mark the collapse of the old center of gravity and the arrival of a figure capable of becoming a new one. Khomeini matters in two registers at once. He is a senior religious authority, and he is also a political organizer and symbol maker operating in a revolutionary environment. His language draws on Shiite Islamic concepts familiar to large parts of society, and those concepts can carry moral force across class lines. In the revolutionary moment, that religious language also functions as a political bridge. It allows secular nationalists, leftists, and Islamists to speak in overlapping terms about justice, dignity, foreign domination, and corruption, even when they disagree sharply about the ideal end state. That bridging effect helps unify a coalition long enough to overwhelm the monarchy's ability to stabilize itself. Yet the same mechanism that unifies in the moment of rupture also contains the seeds of fragmentation. Once the monarchy is gone, the question is no longer simply what must be removed. The question becomes who governs, by what rules, and with what source of ultimate authority. The revolutionary coalition does not last because its members are not merely factions competing for offices. They hold different theories of legitimacy. Some imagine a more conventional republic, anchored in elections and national sovereignty. Some imagine a revolutionary state guided by an Islamic legal and moral framework. Others imagine socialist or Marxist-inspired transformations. The revolution's success creates a new contest, and that contest is about institutions. That brings the story to a concept central to the Islamic Republic's design and later politics, velayat-e-faqih. The phrase is often translated as guardianship of the Islamic jurist. In practical terms, it means a senior Islamic jurist is understood not only as a private religious guide, but as a public guardian with legitimate authority over the state, especially where Islamic principles are said to be at stake. This becomes institutional. In the constitutional system taking shape in 1979, ultimate authority does not rest only in elected offices or in parliament. It is vested in a supreme figure with powers that sit above ordinary mechanisms of republican government. In later common language, this becomes the office of the Supreme Leader. The first major institutional pivot comes quickly, through a referendum on whether Iran should become an Islamic Republic. The vote takes place in late March 1979. Official results report overwhelming approval for the new form of state. At the same time, some political groups boycott the referendum or object to the framing of the choice. That combination matters. The official result helps establish a powerful claim of popular ratification. The boycotts and objections signal that not everyone accepts the new direction as the only legitimate outcome of the revolution. From early on, then, the state is built on a strong assertion of mass legitimacy and on a real contest over who gets to define the revolution's meaning. Next comes constitution making. A body is tasked with drafting and shaping the constitution, and the process culminates in a national vote in December 1979. The constitution that emerges formalizes a system in which republican institutions exist, including elected offices, but they operate alongside, and often under, clerical oversight and religious legal authority. The key shift is that sovereignty is not treated as a simple, undivided flow from voters to officials. Instead, the system is designed with an ultimate supervisory authority that claims religious legitimacy and constitutional power at the same time. To make sense of Iran's later domestic politics and its later behavior abroad, it helps to name several institutions because they recur throughout the story. The Supreme Leader is the highest authority in this system. The office embodies the principle of guardianship by a jurist, and it is designed to sit above day-to-day electoral turnover. Its authority is both constitutional and political, shaping broad direction and acting as a final arbiter across institutions. The Guardian Council is another pivotal body. In general terms, it is designed to ensure that laws and political processes align with the Constitution and with Islamic criteria as interpreted by the system. In practice, it becomes a gatekeeping institution. Oversight of legislation and the vetting of candidates can shape which political choices are available to voters in the first place. The Assembly of Experts is associated with the selection and oversight of the Supreme Leader. Its existence signals that the Supreme Leader is not framed as a monarch, and that there is supposed to be an internal mechanism of accountability within the system's religious constitutional logic. At the same time, the Assembly operates inside the same institutional environment, and its role has to be understood as part of an architecture built to guide and limit political outcomes. Then there are security institutions that grow into central pillars of governance. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, commonly known by its initials as the IRGC, forms as a revolutionary military and security institution distinct from the conventional armed forces. The point is not only defense against external threats, it is also protection of the revolution's ideological and institutional core. Alongside the IRGC, the Basij develops as a mobilizational force associated with internal security and mass participation in defense of the revolutionary project. Over time, The presence of these institutions means power does not run only through ministries and elected offices. It also runs through a security and ideological network that can operate in parallel to formal government, shaping enforcement, boundaries, and political possibilities. This is what is meant by parallel authority. Iran has elected institutions, and those elections matter. But the state is also constructed so that unelected bodies and security institutions have decisive influence, especially on foundational questions of ideology, system preservation, and the boundaries of permissible politics. Electoral competition exists, but it is structured by oversight and by institutions designed to protect the system against outcomes it defines as existentially dangerous. In this early period, the tension between revolutionary mobilization and conventional governance shows up in the experience of the Provisional Revolutionary Government under Mehdi Bazargan. Bazargan represents a strand of revolutionary politics that emphasizes administration, legality, and a transition toward normal state functions. But the revolutionary environment is not normal, and it does not reward caution. The provisional government is politically vulnerable for several reasons. Multiple centers of power exist at once. Legitimacy is contested. Street-level revolutionary energy can overwhelm bureaucratic process. When a state is being refounded, the side that can claim to embody the revolution's essence can outmaneuver the side that emphasizes procedure, especially when a crisis reframes compromise as betrayal. That dynamic helps explain why the next hinge event matters so much: the seizure of the United States Embassy in Tehran and the hostage crisis. On November 4, 1979, a large group of militant students storms the embassy compound. In the seizure, 66 United States citizens are taken hostage, and 52 are held for more than a year. The immediate trigger, as the crisis is commonly narrated, is that the Shah is admitted into the United States for medical treatment. Many in Iran interpret that decision through the lens of recent history, as a sign that Washington may again support the Shah's return or facilitate intervention. In revolutionary politics, symbols matter. The Shah's presence in the United States becomes a symbol powerful enough to mobilize action against the embassy as a perceived nerve center of foreign influence.
The hostage crisis is often remembered primarily as a bilateral rupture between Iran and the United States, and it is exactly that. It hardens public attitudes, collapses trust, and sets a confrontational tone that persists long after the hostages are released. It also reshapes Iran's internal politics in decisive ways. The embassy seizure undercuts those associated with normal diplomatic engagement and gradual stabilization. It empowers hardline factions who argue the revolution remains under threat and that extraordinary measures are justified to prevent restoration of the old order or foreign domination. In that sense, the crisis does not simply reflect domestic power struggles. It accelerates them. In the wake of the seizure, the Provisional Revolutionary Government led by Bazargan resigns. The resignation is more than a personnel change. It symbolizes the defeat of an approach to governance that assumes the new state can quickly behave like a normal state in international affairs. Instead, the embassy seizure helps create conditions in which revolutionary legitimacy is defined through confrontation. In this environment, willingness to challenge the United States becomes, for key factions, a credential of authenticity. The crisis also helps construct a durable narrative of an external enemy. States often use external threats to forge internal cohesion. In Iran's case, the enemy narrative becomes deeply embedded because it aligns with lived historical memory and with the revolution's founding story. The relationship with the United States is no longer only a matter of policy disagreement. It becomes part of the state's identity. That identity shapes security doctrine, media framing, and the interpretation of dissent.
Domestic opponents can be portrayed not merely as political rivals, but as openings for foreign influence. Once that framing becomes normal, it is hard to reverse, because relaxing it can be depicted as exposing the revolution to existential risk. Several turning points during the hostage crisis clarify how the episode evolves and why it ends the way it does. Early on, Ayatollah Khamenei orders the release of 13 hostages on November 17, 1979. That act signals the hostage-taking is not simply chaotic militancy. It is also subject to political direction and symbolic choices about who is held and who is released. Another episode becomes widely known through later accounts as the Canadian Caper. Several Americans connected to the embassy evade capture, are sheltered with Canadian assistance, and eventually leave Iran through a covert operation. The larger significance is not the dramatic detail. It is that the crisis generates improvised diplomacy and intelligence activity, where normal channels freeze and alternative channels carry enormous weight. Then there is the failed United States rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw, in late April 1980. The operation fails, and that failure becomes part of the crisis's political meaning. For the United States, it becomes a national trauma and a symbol of lost control in a situation that demands competence. For Iran's revolutionary leadership and its supporters, the failure reinforces a story of survival against a superpower and validates the claim that vigilance and mobilization are necessary. The crisis ends through an agreement mediated through Algeria, often referred to as the Algiers Accords. The long-held hostages are released on January 20, 1981. The timing is remembered not only as the end of captivity, but as the culmination of a prolonged confrontation that remakes both countries' political landscapes. The United States emerges with more entrenched suspicion of the Islamic Republic. Iran emerges with a political order in which opposition to the United States is not a temporary stance, but a pillar of legitimacy for key factions. The crucial task is to connect the domestic institutional arc to the international rupture, because they reinforce each other. The Constitution and the institutions created in 1979 establish mechanisms for safeguarding the revolution against internal and external threats, as defined by the system. The hostage crisis supplies a vivid, emotionally charged example of those threats and of the stakes of defiance. Together, they create a political environment in which security institutions gain prominence, where moderation can be framed as weakness, and where dissent can be interpreted through a national security lens. The broad revolutionary coalition fractures, and politics becomes increasingly organized around loyalty to the new system's ideological core. Groups that were once allies against the Shah can become rivals or targets once the contest shifts to the nature of the new state. In revolutionary conditions, disagreement is easily cast as sabotage. The question of who counts as the people becomes contested. The state's new institutions provide tools for enforcing one answer over others. By the end of 1979 and into the early 1980s, Iran's post-revolutionary state is no longer just a set of ideals. It is a constitutional order with a distinctive architecture. It is also a political culture shaped by a defining confrontation with the United States. These elements help explain why later events so often activate patterns laid down at the founding, including parallel authority over elected offices, a security-centered view of politics, and an identity built partly through resistance to foreign influence, especially from Washington. Revolutions do not end when a ruler leaves and a constitution is approved. They end, if they end at all, when a new state survives crises that test both capacity and legitimacy. In Iran's case, the next and most punishing test comes soon. The Iran-Iraq War becomes the regime's crucible, not only because of its human and economic costs, but because it further consolidates institutions like the IRGC and normalizes a wartime logic of governance. In late September 1980, Iraq invades Iran at a moment when Iran appears unusually vulnerable from the outside. The revolution has overturned the old order, disrupted chains of command, and intensified internal political conflict. Revolutionary turmoil often looks, to neighbors, like weakness and opportunity. Perceived weakness is only one layer of causality. Territorial and security disputes matter as well. Iran and Iraq have long-standing disagreements tied to borderlands and waterways, and to the strategic vulnerability of oil-producing areas near the frontier. When leaders talk themselves into war, they rarely cite one reason. They stack reasons. They argue that borders are unsettled, that a neighbor is unstable, that threats are growing, and that acting now will prevent worse outcomes later. In that kind of logic, uncertainty becomes a justification. Another layer is regional power competition. The Iranian Revolution is not only a domestic upheaval, it is a regional signal that a major state has changed identity, ideology, and alliances. For neighboring governments that fear revolutionary contagion, the emergence of an openly revolutionary Islamic Republic looks like a political threat as much as a military one. In that environment, war can appear to be a way to contain a new model before it consolidates, and before it inspires challengers elsewhere. None of this removes contingency. Wars begin because leaders make decisions, and because they believe the risks are acceptable. But a multi-cause frame helps keep the story clear. Iraq attacks when Iran seems weak, when disputes feel acute, and when the region's balance of power feels unsettled. The initial military arc is stark. Public accounts describe Iraqi forces advancing along a broad front into Iran's southwest, including Khuzestan province. Iraqi troops capture the city of Khorramshahr, a symbolic and strategic blow. Yet Iraq does not achieve a decisive early victory. The offensive stalls short of key objectives, including an inability to take Abadan, an important oil refining center. That pattern matters. Early gains followed by stalled momentum help explain why the conflict becomes long and punishing. Once the initial push fails to end the war quickly, both sides shift from the hope of rapid victory to the reality of endurance. As the invasion slows, the war enters a phase defined by mobilization. Iran is a post-revolutionary state with political turbulence. It is also a country with deep reserves of nationalism and an emerging revolutionary apparatus capable of mobilizing large numbers of people for defense. Over time, Iran regroups, blunts the invasion, and begins pushing back. The front line hardens, and the early months settle a grim conclusion. Neither side wins quickly at an acceptable cost. The long middle years of the Iran-Iraq War are best understood as attrition. Attrition does not mean nothing happens. It means offensives and counteroffensives consume lives and resources without producing stable, decisive outcomes.
Territory can change hands, but not in a way that ends the conflict. Each side tries to exhaust the other. Each side also tries to sustain morale by telling a story about what the war means. For the Islamic Republic, that story becomes especially consequential. The war is framed not only as a defense of territory, but as a defense of the revolution itself. That framing changes what loyalty looks like. When a government claims it is defending the revolution against an invading enemy, dissent is easier to portray as irresponsibility, betrayal, or collaboration. Wartime politics does not merely respond to danger. It reorganizes the boundaries of acceptable political life. It also matters to keep the human scale in view without turning suffering into spectacle. The war produces enormous casualties and widespread hardship on both sides. It devastates economies and infrastructure, especially in border regions and in sectors tied to energy production and transport. Families are displaced. Cities and towns near the front are damaged.
A generation grows up with the war as a constant fact shaping schooling, work, and memory. Even basic questions like how many people die are harder than they sound. Estimates vary for structural reasons. Record-keeping breaks down in chaos. Missing persons remain uncounted for years. Combatant and civilian categories blur, especially in mass mobilization settings. Governments also have incentives to emphasize or minimize totals. Many historical estimates place total deaths in a range reaching from roughly 1 million to as many as 2 million, with wide disagreement about precise breakdowns. One of the most consequential and morally searing features of the conflict is Iraq's use of chemical weapons. The post-World War II era carries a strong taboo against chemical warfare, even when wars remain brutal by conventional means. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq's chemical attacks become a notorious case of that taboo being broken. Chemical agents are used against Iranian forces, and they are also used against civilians, including Kurdish civilians inside Iraq. The attack associated with Halabja in March 1988 becomes an enduring reference point, often described in public accounts as killing about 5,000 people and injuring many more. This matters not only as a record of suffering, but as a political lesson drawn afterward. When leaders and publics look back on a war where chemical weapons are used, and they perceive that international responses are inadequate or inconsistent, they internalize a conclusion about security. Survival requires self-reliance, credible deterrence, and institutions capable of operating under extreme pressure. That conclusion, whether one agrees with it or not, becomes part of the Islamic Republic's security culture. Another episode becomes vivid in Iranian memory because it directly involves the United States and because it kills civilians. In early July 1988, Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian passenger flight, is shot down by a United States Navy missile cruiser, the USS Vincennes. According to widely cited public accounts, the airliner is mistaken for a hostile aircraft. 290 people are killed, nearly all passengers and crew. In the United States, the event is often discussed through the lens of misidentification and the pressures of a tense military environment. In Iran, it is widely remembered as proof that American power can be lethal, even when Iranians are not combatants, and that accountability can feel absent or insufficient. As with the hostage crisis, the details matter. So does the emotional and political afterlife. Events like this become reference points that shape suspicion for decades. With that wartime context in place, the next step is to see how the conflict accelerates consolidation inside Iran. Emergency politics tends to centralize authority. It expands coercive capacity. It also creates a legitimacy story that is hard for opponents to challenge without appearing to undermine national defense. When the question becomes, who will defend the country and the revolution, organizations that can mobilize, enforce, and fight gain prestige and leverage. This is where the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, becomes central. The IRGC is created to guard the revolution. That is not a decorative title. It signals an institutional mission that is military, ideological, and internal security-oriented. Iran has conventional armed forces, but the IRGC develops as a parallel military structure with its own identity, networks, and claim to be the revolution's most reliable defender. A long war is an institutional school. The IRGC learns logistics, command, recruitment, and the management of large-scale violence. It builds relationships with political leaders and with economic actors involved in sustaining the war effort. Those skills and networks do not vanish when the fighting stops. They persist as institutional power. Alongside the IRGC, the Basij functions as a mass mobilization instrument. The founding logic is to create a broad-based force of volunteers who can be called upon for national defense and for protection of the revolutionary order. During the war, the besiege helps meet manpower needs and embeds the war effort into daily life. It also socializes large numbers of people into a moral language of sacrifice and resistance. Many accounts also describe the use of very young volunteers in some operations, a legacy that remains painful and contested. After the war, the besiege does not simply dissolve. Its role shifts. A mass mobilization structure built for wartime can be repurposed toward internal security and social control. That shift strengthens the state's capacity to monitor, enforce, and discipline behavior in the name of protecting the system. Seen together, the IRGC and the besiege illustrate a broader pattern. The war does not only consume resources, it builds organizations that are difficult to dislodge. Those organizations then shape what politics can be, because they hold capacity that elected offices often lack, especially in moments framed as existential crises. Leadership trajectories also become clearer against the wartime backdrop. Ali Khamenei's rise is a case where a few milestones, in sequence, explain a great deal. He holds significant roles in the early revolutionary period. In June 1981, he survives an assassination attempt and is badly injured. Survival through political violence becomes part of revolutionary credibility and part of the leadership's shared biography. Soon after, additional assassinations reshape the leadership landscape. In late August 1981, President Mohammad Ali Rajai is killed, creating a sudden vacancy at the top of the formal executive. Khamenei becomes president in the succession that follows. The office is important, but it remains bounded by the Islamic Republic's hybrid design, where clerical oversight and security institutions constrain what presidents can do. The final step in that arc arrives after Ayatollah Khomeini's death in June 1989. Khamenei moves from the presidency to the position of Supreme Leader, the apex of authority in the system created after 1979. Personal biography and institutional consolidation move together. That transition is also accompanied by constitutional changes in 1989 that clarify how the system adapts to practical needs. One change involves the qualifications for the Supreme Leader. In Iran's Shiite religious hierarchy, a marja is a senior authority, often described as a source of emulation for religious guidance. The original constitutional framework links the Supreme Leader role to that kind of high clerical standing. In 1989, the requirement is removed. The effect is to widen the pool of eligible candidates and to align the political office more closely with governance realities than with the highest threshold of traditional clerical rank. Another change eliminates the office of Prime Minister. Early post-revolutionary governance includes both a president and a prime minister, which can produce rivalry and confusion over executive authority. Removing the prime ministership consolidates executive responsibility more clearly under the presidency, while still leaving the presidency subordinate to the Supreme Leader's overarching power. A third development is the creation of the Expediency Discernment Council. Its basic function is to mediate disputes within the system, especially when institutions such as Parliament and the Guardian Council clash. In practice, it creates an additional channel through which elite conflict can be contained inside the regime's own structures rather than escalating into open institutional breakdown. For a state shaped by revolution and war, that kind of internal conflict management mechanism is part of how the system survives. By this point, the system's basic mechanics are clear in practice.
The Islamic Republic includes elected institutions, including a president and a parliament. Those elections matter because they can shift priorities, rhetoric, and the balance among competing currents. But the elected sphere operates within boundaries enforced by unelected institutions, especially the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council. Wartime conditions strengthen this model because war intensifies the perceived stakes of political deviation. If leaders can plausibly argue that internal division invites external attack, then institutions that enforce boundaries gain legitimacy.
The war accelerates a consolidation that the revolution begins. Security institutions and clerical oversight become permanent features of governance, not occasional interventions. From there, it becomes easier to see how domestic consolidation connects to regional projection. Institutions that gain power through wartime defense also develop capabilities that can be used beyond Iran's borders. Within the broader IRGC structure, the Quds Force emerges as the external operations arm. The core idea is that security is not managed only at the border. It can also be managed by shaping the environment beyond the border, building relationships, and supporting aligned actors in neighboring arenas. Whether one describes that as deterrence, forward defense, or destabilization depends on vantage point. But as a strategic pattern, it follows from a revolutionary state's sense of encirclement and from its experience of a long, costly war. Lebanon becomes an early and durable case for how this strategy takes shape. In 1982, Israel invades Lebanon, intensifying a conflict already shaped by civil war dynamics and outside intervention. Iranian advisors deploy to Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, and Iranian resources help organize, fund, and train a predominantly Shiite militia that becomes Hezbollah. Over time, Hezbollah becomes not only a wartime partner, but a durable ally with local roots, political influence, and military capacity. For Iran, the relationship demonstrates a strategic lesson. Partnerships with non-state armed groups can extend influence and create leverage at far lower cost than direct state-to-state war. This is also where institutions and strategy reinforce each other. The IRGC's growing influence at home supports resources and autonomy for external operations. External successes, in turn, reinforce the Guard's prestige and the logic that revolutionary defense requires action beyond Iran's borders. Strategy becomes institutionally embedded. It is carried by organizations whose identity and mission are tied to preserving the revolution, not only by the preferences of a single elected administration. To keep the overall narrative coherent, it is enough to note the later arc without detailing it yet. In the 1990s, Afghanistan becomes one arena where Iran's security concerns play out. After 2003, Iraq becomes a central theater again, under radically changed conditions. After 2011, conflicts in Syria and Yemen become prominent in how outside observers describe Iran's regional posture. Those later cases belong to the next phase of the story. For now, the key point is that the template is visible by the end of the 1980s. Iran's security institutions develop external tools, and they use them to shape outcomes beyond Iran's borders. As this second part closes, the synthesis is simple. The war builds institutions. Those institutions shape strategy. That strategy reshapes the region and feeds back into Iran's sense of threat and identity. The Iran-Iraq War is not only battlefield history. It is an accelerator of the Islamic Republic's governing mechanics, its security culture, and its external playbook. With that foundation in place, the next questions are less about whether Iran becomes a normal post-revolutionary state and more about how a security-centered, institutionally layered republic navigates pressure, pursues deterrence, and manages legitimacy at home. Those questions carry the narrative into later decades, where proxy conflicts, sanctions, and nuclear diplomacy become intertwined with recurring domestic protest movements and leadership struggles. The third part brings the story's separate-looking threads into one frame. Iran's nuclear diplomacy is not a standalone technical dispute. Sanctions are not only an economic instrument, and regional proxy conflict is not only a foreign policy choice. In practice, these arenas feed into Iran's internal legitimacy, into how the state explains itself, how it finances itself, how it polices boundaries at home, and how citizens decide whether the system still speaks for them. A useful place to begin is the nuclear dispute, because it is where technical detail, international law, and domestic politics collide most visibly. Iran is a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, usually shortened to the NPT. In broad terms, the NPT is built on a bargain. States without nuclear weapons commit not to pursue them. In exchange, they retain the right to peaceful nuclear technology under rules and inspections. The rules matter because the same industrial base that supports civilian nuclear energy can also support a weapons pathway if a state chooses to move in that direction. The key institution on verification is the International Atomic Energy Agency, commonly called the IAEA. The IAEA's job is not to read minds or declare a country good or bad. It is to account for nuclear material, monitor declared facilities, and investigate questions about undeclared activities when evidence or reporting raises concerns. That means the credibility of public claims often depends on what inspectors can access, what material is declared, and what questions remain unresolved. To make sense of why enrichment levels and stockpiles become politically explosive terms, one technical idea helps in plain language. Uranium enrichment is a process that increases the concentration of a particular isotope. At lower levels, enriched uranium can be used for certain civilian reactors and research needs. At much higher levels, it can move closer to what is generally understood as weapons-usable material. As enrichment rises and as stockpiles grow, outside governments worry that the time needed to produce enough material for a weapon shrinks. Even if a state insists it has no intent to build a weapon, the combination of higher enrichment and the larger stockpile can look, to rivals, like a latent capability that changes the regional balance of power. This is why the nuclear issue is never only technical. It is also political signaling. For Iranian leaders, enrichment can be framed as sovereignty, scientific progress, and refusal to submit to coercion. For many external actors, enrichment is framed as a risk indicator, especially when parts of the program are alleged to have been concealed from inspectors at various points. The public record over the years includes IAEA reporting about safeguards questions and verification disputes. It also includes intense disagreement about what those disputes imply about Iran's end goals. One practical method for sorting claims is a three-part discipline: claim, public record, and open question. First, identify the claim being made. Is someone claiming a technical capability, such as the ability to enrich to a certain level or to operate a certain type of facility? Is someone claiming intent, such as a decision to build a bomb? Or is someone claiming evidence of weaponization work, meaning concrete steps to design and build an actual weapon, not just to produce nuclear material? Second, ask what the public record can support. IAEA reports, official statements by governments, and verifiable documentation sometimes narrow the range of plausible interpretations. But they do not always settle the question. Verification depends on access and cooperation. Intelligence claims are also not always made public in full, even when leaders insist they are decisive. Third, maim the open question that remains instead of filling it with certainty. A state can have significant technical capability without having made a political decision to build a weapon. A state can also express peaceful intent while preserving options. Outside actors can disagree about whether a particular technical step is primarily bargaining leverage, defensive hedging, or preparation for weaponization. The goal is to be precise about what is known, what is evidenced, and what is inferred. With that discipline in place, a major milestone comes into focus: the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the JCPOA. It is reached in 2015 after years of escalating dispute, sanctions, and diplomacy. At its core, the JCPOA is designed as a trade. Iran accepts constraints and monitoring measures that limit aspects of its nuclear program. In exchange, it receives sanctions relief. The strategic logic is to reduce proliferation risk by increasing transparency and extending the time it would take to produce enough nuclear material for a weapon, while also giving Iran a material incentive to comply. The political controversy is built into that structure. Inside Iran, opponents argue that constraints are a humiliating limitation on sovereignty and that the United States cannot be trusted to keep its side of the bargain. Supporters argue that sanctions relief is vital for economic stability and that verified limits reduce the risk of war. In the United States, critics argue that the deal is too narrow, too temporary, or too disconnected from Iran's regional activities. Supporters argue that verified constraint is preferable to unconstrained escalation, and that diplomacy is a tool to prevent a nuclear crisis from becoming a military one. The JCPOA, therefore, becomes more than an agreement. It becomes a symbol in both countries' domestic politics. It is interpreted through deeper patterns established earlier in this lecture, including Iran's suspicion of United States motives and the United States' suspicion of Iran's revolutionary state. When an agreement rests on compliance and trust in verification, the political system on each side has to sustain it through moments of tension. That willingness proves fragile. The turning point comes in 2018, when the United States withdraws from the agreement and reimposes sanctions. In broad terms, sanctions pressure hits Iran's economy through multiple channels. It constrains oil exports and foreign exchange earnings. It deters international companies from investing or trading. It complicates banking and payment mechanisms. The economic effects are not merely abstract. They translate into currency instability, inflation pressures, uncertainty for businesses, and diminished job prospects, especially for younger people. Reporting in the years after the JCPOA often describes Iran as gaining economic breathing room during the period of sanctions relief and then losing that space after the reversal. That kind of boom and bust experience matters politically because it trains citizens to doubt that any improvement will last. Sanctions also operate as political instruments inside Iran, not only as pressure from outside. They can strengthen hardline narratives that the United States seeks to keep Iran weak, regardless of Iranian concessions. They can weaken the credibility of factions that argue for engagement by making engagement look naive or futile. At the same time, economic pain can turn inward, becoming a legitimacy problem for the state itself. A government can ask citizens to endure hardship for sovereignty. That argument wears thin if hardship becomes chronic, corruption is perceived as entrenched, and political participation feels constrained. After 2018, a recognizable escalation pattern takes shape. Iran takes nuclear steps that move its program beyond the limits the JCPOA had established. In public reporting and in IAEA updates, this includes enrichment levels and stockpiles far above the deal's caps. External actors respond with diplomatic pressure, threats of additional sanctions, and heightened attention to verification. In this phase, the IAEA's role becomes even more politically central. When trust collapses, inspections and reporting become the main, widely recognized basis for credible claims. When monitoring is reduced, or disputes with inspectors deepen, outsiders have less solid ground for confident public statements, and the space for worst-case interpretation expands. This is where the earlier method, claim, public record, and open question, becomes more than a study tool. It becomes a way to understand how crises become self-reinforcing. If one side believes the other is hiding intentions, it interprets ambiguity as menace. If the other side believes pressure is permanent regardless of compliance, it interprets restraint as pointless. Under those conditions, even technical moves that are presented as reversible bargaining chips can be read as permanent steps toward a dangerous threshold. Now place that nuclear standoff into the region's security geometry. Israel's threat perception is shaped by a combination of geography, history, and the belief that a hostile regional power near a nuclear capability would change the strategic landscape fundamentally. Gulf Arab states, especially those across the waterway from Iran, often view Iran's military reach and political influence as an immediate concern. For them, the nuclear issue is not separate from missiles, shipping security, and the fear that Iran could act more aggressively under a nuclear umbrella, even if it never tests a weapon. The United States carries long-standing regional partnerships and commitments. It also carries the legacy of the hostage crisis and decades of mutual suspicion with the Islamic Republic. The result is a multi-actor security dilemma. Steps that one side calls deterrence are experienced by another as preparation for coercion. Alongside the nuclear track runs a parallel track that often does as much to drive tension: Iran's proxy and partner network. The basic strategic idea, built over decades and strengthened by the war and encirclement logic discussed earlier, is that Iran seeks deterrence and depth. By cultivating relationships with aligned militias and political military actors, Iran can complicate the plans of stronger conventional adversaries, create multiple points of pressure, and gain bargaining leverage without relying only on direct state-to-state confrontation. From Iran's perspective, these partners can be framed as forward defense and as a way to prevent isolation. From the perspective of Israel, many Gulf states, and the United States, these networks are often framed as destabilizing tools that extend Iranian influence through armed groups operating outside normal state control. Whatever label is used, the practical effect is clear. Regional crises are no longer contained within borders. They become linked arenas where escalation can jump from one theater to another, and where retaliation can be routed through partners in ways that blur attribution and complicate deterrence. This proxy strategy also creates blowback. Armed partners can drag their patron into unwanted escalations. They can provoke counter-coalitions among states that fear encirclement by Iran's network. They can intensify sectarian framing in local politics, even when the original conflicts are not purely sectarian. They can also produce civilian harm that deepens cycles of anger and revenge. The proxy network can create bargaining power, but it can also create a persistent crisis environment in which miscalculation becomes easier. When nuclear tension, sanctions, and proxy conflict run together for years, domestic politics does not sit outside the system. It absorbs the pressure. Iran experiences recurring protest waves that function as legitimacy tests, each shaped by its moment, but connected by underlying structural tensions, including economic strain, political exclusion, and competing visions of what the Islamic Republic should be. One key episode is the Green Movement after the disputed 2009 presidential election. The core issue is not only who wins, but whether the electoral process is trusted. When large numbers of citizens believe their votes are not meaningfully counted, an election stops being a mechanism of legitimacy and becomes a trigger for mass mobilization. The state, in turn, often frames such mobilization as a security threat, not simply a political complaint. That framing draws on a long-standing tendency, built into the post-revolutionary security culture, to interpret internal dissent through the lens of foreign influence and regime survival. A later wave comes with fuel price protests spanning 2019 into the period that follows. Here, the trigger is overtly economic, but the anger is not only about a single policy. It is about accumulated frustration in an economy under heavy pressure and in a political environment where many people feel they have limited avenues to influence decisions. Reporting on casualties is contested, with different sources offering different figures, and with the state's level of transparency itself becoming part of the controversy. The analytic point is not one definitive number. It is that violent crackdowns and disputes over what happened deepen mistrust and can turn economic protests into broader legitimacy crises. This brings the narrative to a movement that marks a qualitative shift: the protests after the death of Mahsa Amini in September 2022 and the emergence of the slogan, "Women, Life, Freedom." What is widely reported at the core is that Amini, a young woman, dies after being detained by Iran's morality police. Different accounts circulate about the precise sequence of events and responsibility. And those disputes matter because they shape how the state is judged. But the political spark is clear. Many Iranians interpret the death as an emblem of coercive control over daily life, especially over women's bodies and behavior. Many also see it as evidence that enforcement practices can be arbitrary and deadly. The slogan, "Women, Life, Freedom" matters because it compresses multiple demands into a simple, portable phrase. It is about women's rights and the rejection of compulsory enforcement over dress and personal life. It is also about dignity in everyday existence, and about a broader aspiration for political and social freedom. Compared with earlier movements, public reporting often describes these protests as more ideologically challenging to the system, more socially diffuse, and harder to contain through conventional political concessions. They are not only a dispute within the system's existing categories, such as reform versus conservative. They often sound like a challenge to the legitimacy of enforced social control, and, in some voices, to the system's authority more broadly. Understanding how the state responds requires a clear description of its coercive toolkit, especially the role of institutions built and empowered in the early decades. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is not only a military organization in the narrow sense. It is a pillar of regime security with deep influence. The Basij functions as a mobilizational and internal security force that can be activated in moments of unrest. Alongside these are policing institutions, intelligence and surveillance capabilities, and a legal apparatus that can translate street dissent into charges framed as threats to national security. In practical terms, the toolkit includes crowd control and force, arrests and detention, intimidation, and monitoring of communications and organization. The logic is not only to end a protest on a given day, it is to deter sustained mobilization by raising the expected cost of participation and by disrupting networks that could coordinate over time. Here, the integration becomes unavoidable. External pressure can strengthen the state's security narrative, making it easier to portray dissent as a vulnerability that enemies will exploit. External pressure can also weaken the state's performance legitimacy by constraining economic opportunity and making everyday life harder. The state then leans more heavily on coercion and ideological loyalty tests, which can intensify resentment. A cycle forms in which sanctions and security crises do not simply pressure the government. They reshape the relationship between the government and society. At the same time, it is important not to simplify Iran into a single mood or a single political actor. The Islamic Republic contains factions, competing institutions, and real electoral dynamics within constrained boundaries. Public sentiment varies by class, region, generation, and experience with the state. Some citizens prioritize stability and fear the chaos that could follow a collapse. Others prioritize rights and accountability and see continued coercion as intolerable. Many feel both at once, including fear and anger, national pride and exhaustion. These internal tensions become especially salient when thinking about leadership dynamics approaching 2026. Here, evidentiary discipline matters. Iran's constitution lays out a formal structure for succession. The Assembly of Experts is the body associated with selecting the Supreme Leader and, at least in principle, overseeing that office. This is not a direct popular election for the Supreme Leader. It is an internal institutional mechanism within the Islamic Republic's own architecture. That architecture also includes the broader vetting ecosystem, often associated with the Guardian Council, which shapes who can hold office and thus shapes the composition of bodies that matter in a succession moment. What is verified and widely accepted in the public record is that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei holds the office from 1989 onward. Beyond that, late-period claims and rumors are common, especially in an environment where secrecy, propaganda, and rapid news cycles can distort public understanding. Assertions about behind-the-scenes decisions are difficult to evaluate without multiple, credible, checkable sources.
A responsible approach is to separate what the constitutional system says can happen from what any particular report claims did happen. With that caution in place, it is still possible to analyze structured succession pathways without pretending to predict the future. One pathway is continuity, in which the Supreme Leader remains in office through the mid-2020s. In that scenario, the system's public posture emphasizes stability. The security apparatus continues to treat regional tension and domestic protest as linked threats. Nuclear policy remains a bargaining arena where the system tries to balance deterrence, sanctions relief, and the risk of military confrontation. The Assembly of Experts remains institutionally important, but it does not become the center of day-to-day politics because the selection mechanism is not activated. Another pathway is a transition, in which the succession mechanism is activated. In that case, the formal role of the Assembly of Experts moves from background to foreground. But outcomes are shaped not only by the Assembly's rules, they are shaped by the broader institutional ecosystem, including vetting that influences who sits in key bodies, elite networks that form consensus candidates, and the security apparatus's imperative to protect the system from fragmentation. In a transition moment, the overriding goal is often to avoid the appearance of vulnerability. That can mean moving quickly to present unity, emphasizing constitutional procedure, and relying on the IRGC and associated institutions to deter both internal unrest and external opportunism. Outside actors watch closely, but their influence is limited. External pressure can shape incentives at the margins, yet it cannot directly choose Iran's leader. Heavy-handed external actions can also backfire by reinforcing the system's claim that it faces existential threat, tightening elite cohesion, at least temporarily. In general terms, succession dynamics are likely to be filtered through the core logic described earlier: guided authority, protection of the revolution, and parallel power centers that limit the elected sphere's ability to override the security and clerical core. Across these broad pathways, the same underlying tensions persist. Sanctions and isolation make economic management harder and intensify distributional conflict. Proxy networks create deterrence, but also generate escalatory risk and international backlash. Nuclear steps can increase bargaining leverage, but also increase the danger of miscalculation, especially when verification becomes contested. Domestic protest movements can expose legitimacy gaps that coercion can suppress, but not necessarily resolve. To close this lecture, return to the integrative claim in a form that holds the whole narrative together. Iran's post-revolutionary system is built to survive pressure. It learns, during war and repeated crisis, to treat survival as the highest priority. That survival logic pushes power toward security institutions and toward ideological boundary setting. But the same logic imposes costs. It narrows political inclusion, elevates coercion, and makes economic adaptation harder in a sanctions-heavy environment. Meanwhile, external actors respond to Iran's deterrent strategies, including nuclear leverage and proxy partnerships, by building counter-pressures that often reinforce Iran's threat narrative. A self-reinforcing cycle is always nearby. As you keep thinking about Iran through 2026, several open questions are worth holding in mind. How durable is the state's legitimacy
when large shares of society experience economic strain and political exclusion at the same time. How much can verification stabilize a nuclear dispute when trust is low and domestic politics in multiple countries reward confrontation? Whether proxy networks continue to function primarily as deterrents or whether their blowback increasingly outweighs their strategic value. And, in any succession scenario, whether the system responds to uncertainty by tightening coercion and narrowing inclusion, or whether it experiments, however cautiously, with a broader basis for legitimacy that reduces the need for constant internal securitization. Those questions do not have tidy answers, and the public record rarely offers certainty on the timelines that political drama demands.
But with the institutional foundations laid in 1979, the war-forged security culture of the 1980s, and the later interplay of nuclear diplomacy, sanctions, regional conflict and protest movements, the overall structure becomes legible. Iran's story is not a sequence of isolated crises. It is a connected system in which external confrontation and internal legitimacy repeatedly reshape each other. Sources: Encyclopedia Britannica, various reference articles on the Iranian Revolution, Ruhollah Khomeini, Ali Khamenei, the Iran hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq War, Hezbollah, and the Quds Force. These entries were used for the core narrative timeline and widely cited baseline facts, including key dates in 1979, major leadership transitions, and standard casualty and context summaries for the hostage crisis and the Iran-Iraq War. Constitute Project: Iran's Constitution of 1979 and the 1989 Amendments. This constitutional text and commentary were used for the institutional architecture of the Islamic Republic, including the role of the Supreme Leader, the Assembly of Experts, the Guardian Council, and major changes made in 1989, such as removing the requirement that the Supreme Leader be a marja and eliminating the office of Prime Minister. Official text of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, including referendum figures as commonly reported. This was used for the reported results of the 1979 referendum on the Islamic Republic and the December 1979 constitutional referendum, and for the formal language tied to clerical authority and state structure. Council on Foreign Relations, background explainer on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds Force. This was used for the structure and command relationships of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, its political and economic footprint, its control of strategic capabilities like missiles, and its role in projecting power through regional partners. Wilson Center, Iran's Islamist Proxies Overview. This was used for a consolidated map of major Iran-aligned non-state actors, and for the basic framework describing how Tehran has built and sustained proxy relationships across multiple theaters. Iran Primer, background on the Basij resistance force. This was used for the Basij's origins, its integration into the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, its constitutional and ideological justifications, and its evolution from wartime mobilization to domestic security enforcement. Airborne and Special Operations Museum, account of Operation Eagle Claw, cross-checked with Encyclopedia Britannica. These were used for the key operational facts of the April 1980 rescue attempt, including the Desert One collision, the role of the sandstorm conditions, and the fatalities. United Nations sources on Security Council Resolution 598, including the United Nations Digital Library. These materials were used for the official language and chronology of the ceasefire framework that culminated in the 1988 end of major Iran-Iraq war fighting under United Nations supervision. HistoryNet, long-form reporting on major Iran-Iraq war campaigns and turning points. This was used for specific operational episodes and narrative detail, including the Al-Fa campaign, the Karbala offensives, and the way the war's endgame was described in contemporaneous rhetoric and later reconstructions. France 24, biographical and retrospective reporting on Ali Khamenei. This was used for concise biographical details, including the 1981 assassination attempt that badly injured him, and for descriptions of the controversial and accelerated clerical elevation associated with his rise to supreme leader. Retrospect Journal. Essay-level overview of the revolution and early post-revolution governance. This was used for a stitched-together account of the early coalition period and the formation of the Provisional Revolutionary Government under Mehdi Bazargan, as commonly described in secondary historical summaries. Washington Institute reporting on Hezbollah, including widely cited force capability and financing estimates. This was used for high-level quantitative claims commonly repeated in policy analysis, including estimates of Hezbollah's rocket and missile stockpiles and the range of annual financial support attributed to Iranian backing in public reporting. This concludes the audiobook narration.
Thank you for listening.